Hello, and welcome to reInvent 2021. I am your host, Brian Terry from the CloudFormation team. And today we're going to be talking about how to reuse patterns when developing infrastructure as code. Specifically, we're going to look at developing CloudFormation assets and sharing those across your organization. We're going to dive deep into a lot of different scenarios and a lot of different features of CloudFormation and also AWS CDK. So let's jump right into it. So when you're developing infrastructure as code, it's very much programming. So when I think of infrastructure as code, I always go back to this one simple quote. Good programmers know what to write, and great ones know what to rewrite. All right, so let me tell you a little bit about myself. So I currently work at AWS as a developer advocate, and I get to travel the world talking about infrastructure as code. Before I worked for AWS, I worked for a very small startup in which I took a role as a DevOps engineer. And you may be asking yourself, how did this guy learn CloudFormation and how is he giving this presentation about CloudFormation? Well, it went something like this. So 5 years ago, I took that role as a DevOps engineer, and my boss called down to my office on my very first day, and the conversation went something like this. He actually called down and asked me to create this infrastructure in CloudFormation. Basically, he wanted me to create a VPN solution that was auto-scaling across multiple AZs. He wanted it to be deployed in CloudFormation, and he wanted to have kind of a push-button deployment just in case something happened. So I was like, sure, I could do this. Absolutely, sir, I can do this. So I just have two questions for you. Number one, what is CloudFormation? And what is AWS? So luckily, I dove deep into the CloudFormation documentation and also into AWS. And I understood how to create this infrastructure and how to develop this infrastructure over the course of the week. And fortunately, I was able to get that project into them over the week. But for me, that was the turning point. I really began to love CloudFormation and infrastructure as code because I had to really dig deep in finding out the solution for this problem that I had to solve. So, CloudFormation, what is it? So let's start at the beginning. Let's do a recap of what infrastructure as code is. So basically, CloudFormation is our service for infrastructure as code. And it works something like this. You code your templates in YAML or JSON, and basically you upload these templates to S3. Then when you upload these templates to S3, it creates a stack, and then you manage these stacks as a whole. So you should be familiar with CloudFormation if you're viewing this presentation, because this is a 300 level presentation, so I assume that you've used CloudFormation before. So this is very much kind of remedial. So in our typical, if you're developing infrastructure as code and you're deploying these assets across your organization, this is something you typically do every day. So let's assume that I don't work for AWS right now. I work for a small startup as a DevOps engineer. So I've taken a role and I get this email like this. It says, hey, Brian, this is Sam from R&D. We need a deployment pipeline for our new service. Can you create and deploy this by the end of the day? I'm sure if you're a DevOps engineer or if you're working with AWS and you control your company's infrastructure or deploy your company's infrastructures, I assume you've gotten an email like this before, and it had to be kind of a rush in order to create this infrastructure. So let's assume that I've taken amount of time, maybe a couple of days, to flush out this architecture, and it looks something like this. So it's a very simple architecture. Basically, people push to GitHub, then a Lambda function runs, and then it puts the deployment artifacts in S3. Very simple architecture. Assume I've created a CloudFormation for this, and let's take a look at how you deploy this in your organization. So in this demo, we're just going to deploy CloudFormation, just like you've probably done millions of times, but we're just going to go through the scenario so we can just set a baseline of what it's like to deploy CloudFormation in your typical organization. Okay, for our first demonstration, we're just going to deploy our standard CloudFormation template. Let's just assume I've spent a week creating this infrastructure. As you can see, it's probably about 1,000 lines or so. So what I'm going to do is just create a stack,
I know a number of you have probably done this a million times before, but we're just going to review the process of deploying a CloudFormation template. I'll just give our pipeline a name, I'll keep the default, and I'll create a stack. So as you can see in this first demonstration, we've just created a standard CloudFormation template for our organization that consists of a deployment pipeline. And later on in this presentation, what we're going to do is we're going to reuse this CloudFormation template across our organization using a couple of different tools. And now our stack's complete, and that's how we deploy a standard CloudFormation template in our account. So let's see how we can reuse this across our organization.
Okay, now that we've seen a demo of how to deploy CloudFormation, probably something you've done millions of times, let's talk about the challenges of deploying a CloudFormation and kind of what I had to do to create this infrastructure. So some of the challenges we see with developing infrastructure as code is builders spend too much time trying to figure out the resource intricacies and the best practices. So for myself, it took me a couple of days. But when I first started developing CloudFormation and working as a DevOps engineer, this could probably take days or even weeks to understand these best practices and how to deploy these CloudFormation templates. And then another challenge is applications are shared commonly across architecture elements, right? So for example, if you have to create one or more Lambda functions that can read or write a DynamoDB table, basically you can reuse that in CloudFormation templates, and it comes up all the time. So you have to literally copy that code from one CloudFormation template to another. And then another challenge is modeling this infrastructure becomes repetitive. You're constantly repeating and creating the wheel. You're defining and configuring each service. You're integrating with other services. You're adhering to best practices. And it's just, you do this all over and over again for sometimes almost the same infrastructure. And then finally, it takes valuable deployment time to build unique features into these CloudFormation templates. So like in that example that we just did, what if we just had to tweak it just a little bit to go maybe from GitHub to maybe something like CodeDeploy or internal repository. You can see how it can become kind of complex and time consuming to redo that CloudFormation for that specific one task. So luckily, AWS has come up with a number of solutions for this problem. So then we're going to actually look at those today. Specifically, we're going to look at two different products that can help you with reusing these assets across your organization. Number one, we're going to look at CloudFormation modules, and next we're going to look at CloudFormation CDK. So first, let's start with modules. What are CloudFormation modules is the question that may come to your mind. Well, we're going to look at that, and we're going to really dive deep. So if we take a 10,000-foot view of what modules are, they are like this. They basically encapsulate common solutions. And then they're opinionated best practices, and they're reusable across organizations. So basically, there are assets that you can create that have these different properties that you can share across your organization. So let's quickly take an example of kind of what that looks like. So for example, you create a CloudFormation template, and this CloudFormation template is the best practice on deploying an S3 bucket in your organization. Specifically, you want to turn on some security best practices, maybe a delete policy, or you just don't want to make it public access or something like that. So basically, you've created this CloudFormation template with S3 best practices. Now, let's look at how you can create a module with this. So if you look at on the left, you have your 20 lines of code for your CloudFormation template. Well, when you create a module, you just reuse that template, and it becomes a couple of lines in another CloudFormation template, and you can use it like a resource. So essentially, it's kind of taking that big CloudFormation template and all the assets inside that and creating what looks to be a simple resource with a specific ending, and that's : modules. So let's double click on that and take a deeper look into what modules are. So when using modules, You can use module in the resource section of a CloudFormation template. So these modules essentially kind of look like AWS resources. They're very simple, they have properties, they even have outputs. And you can differentiate these resources because they have this fourth section, this : module. So if we look at this example, we can see that this module has AWS S3 private bucket access : module. And then the template uses these modules, the templates that use these modules can be either in JSON or in YAML. Again, you can use these modules just like AWS resources. So what's cool about modules is under the hood, they create this schema. And we'll take a look at that when we really dive into the demo. But just think of this schema as the way that this CloudFormation template is modeled inside the resource itself. And luckily, the AWS CloudFormation CLI takes care of that for us. So when you send the demo, all we need to do is just put a CloudFormation template in a fragments folder, and then the CLI generates this schema for us. So once you create your module, let's take a look at what the module platform looks like and how do you share these and how does it all work? Well, it looks something like this. So if we stand back and we look at the modules platforms, basically on the left side, you have your publisher, and on the right side, you have your consumers, right? And then in the middle, you have the CloudFormation registry. This is a central point for sharing. So on the publisher side, publishers like AWS services, internal experts, CloudFormation community, worldwide communities, anyone can contribute to the CloudFormation registry. So they're able to create these modules and these best practices. So like in that example I just showed with the S3 private bucket, I could create that as a module and then share that within the CloudFormation registry. And then on the right side, the consumers, they can consume these modules and use these within their organization. So these template authors, these developers, anyone that uses CloudFormation can take advantage of these modules. So if I was a DevOps engineer and I had to do that assignment all over again, maybe I would use modules. Instead of trying to reinvent the wheel and trying to figure out these best practices, maybe in the registry, I can find the solution that kind of matches what my boss needed. And instead of creating that in a week, maybe I could have done it in a couple of days, even without knowing very much about CloudFormation. So this registry platform, who does this benefit? Does it benefit the developers? Does it benefit AWS? Who does this really benefit? Well, it benefits everyone, right? So let's take a look at how it benefits everyone. So it benefits everyone because on the publisher side, they're able to encapsulate and share these best practices across the organizations. They're able to distribute updates using native version management, right? And then on the consumer side, they can effortlessly adhere to best practices and guidelines. They can extract away the resource intricacies and easier authoring, which means they can use these modules in their templates very easy and know that they're using the best practice for deploying those resources. And then they can reuse these assets across multiple CloudFormation templates. A lot of times these modules are just 10 lines of code versus creating a multi-line CloudFormation template and then editing that. Again, saving them time, allowing them to create this infrastructure quickly. So they can just reuse them as module components. So they can take one module from here, one module from there, and combine them to create the solution that they need. So you can see how this benefits everyone in creating these modules and sharing them and having this CloudFormation registry. So the cool thing about modules is the availability of them. There are two ways that you can publish to, or the consumers can take advantage of this. So we have what's called the private registry and the public registry. What's the difference? Well, it's very simple, right? So the private registry are those resources that are published inside your organization's registry. Specifically, if people in your organization want to create these assets that should not be shared with the community at large, basically they can put those in a CloudFormation registry, and anyone within your company or anyone within your organization can consume those, can push updates, can use those across your organization. And then we have the public registry. The public registry is what it's specifically called out to be, a public registry in which anyone can push to this registry and anyone can use these assets inside these registry. Specifically, third-party vendors such as MongoDB and Atlassian have created third-party resources and published them to the registry. And you can take advantage of those architectural best practices by simply just enabling those modules in account. So you can see how this benefits everyone, right? So the CloudFormation, let's double click and let's take another deeper look into what it is. So with modules and the CloudFormation registry, modules are just CloudFormation templates that are encapsulated into these modules and they act just like resources and then they're published to the registry. Then these modules are listed in the console and provide details about the version, the description, and the publisher. So they're easy to find, they're curated quite nicely, and you can take advantage of them as you see fit. So by clicking on the module, it displays additional details about the resource, including a parameter and a schema, and you can also see what resources are going to be provisioned inside this module. So how cool is that? So modules are really cool, but there are a couple things to note that you can modify modules input parameters. So again, this functions just like a resource. You can edit your parameters, you can change the parameters of what you push into a module, and you have those outputs, just like a typical resource. The ref function works inside the module, so it's very similar to your standard CloudFormation template, how you can reference different parameters. And the function get at attributes work inside the module, so you can get at specific resources inside the modules. However, resources and properties can't be modified in a module. So for example, if you download a module and it's a VPN solution and it has a couple of different assets, maybe it has an EC2 instance, maybe it has an auto scaling group, etc., 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 you can't go in and remove specific parts of that. Specifically, you couldn't remove the EC2 instance. You basically have to use it as a whole and assume that it's a black box and that you have these input parameters and you have these output parameters. So I'm actually getting an email right now. This is kind of weird. So, James, he's a front-end team and he's asking me to create a deployment pipeline in Angular, and he needs this app to be hosted in S3 and it needs to be ready in 2 days. Wow, I guess the other request was like a week. So I can get this done for James. So for this, let's take advantage of modules. So I've already invested time in creating a CloudFormation template earlier. So now let's just reuse that as a module. So if we look at that architecture again, I've created this wonderful architecture on deploying this asset to S3 using these Lambda functions. So let's use this and create a module and then reuse this to create the solution that we need to for this team. So I've got this module, this CloudFormation infrastructure, and let's create this infrastructure here, and then we'll link them together with modules. So if we look at this, first we'll create a module, and the module will be that pipeline module. So it's basically what we had earlier, that CloudFormation template. We're going to go ahead and use that template and create a module out of it. Then we're going to take this new infrastructure that we have to create, which is the expanded publishing artifact, and we're going to call that the product publishing module. So specifically to be called Spacely App Product Module. And basically we'll create a module out of this. And then what we'll do is we'll combine both of those using a CloudFormation template. As you can see, we'll have one CloudFormation template that uses these modules, and we'll use these modules in this template and deploy this solution. So let's quickly take a look at a demo to see how this really works.
Okay, let's jump into the demonstration. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually just going to clone a GitHub repository that have both our CloudFormation templates that we created earlier in this presentation. And I'm going to clone those here in this folder. And now I'm going to create a folder to host our modules. So I'm going to create a folder for our app. and I'm going to create a folder for our pipeline. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to start with our pipeline. So we're going to create a module for this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a Python virtual environment, and then I'm going to source that directory. Next, I'm going to install the CloudFormation CLI and the Java plugin. Okay, we can see that CFN is installed, or the CFN CLI is installed. Now I'm going to run CFN init, and I'm going to answer a few questions about creating this project. So first I'm going to do is it's going to ask me, do I want to create a module or a resource type? I'm going to choose a module, and we're going to give it a name of Spacely Pipeline Prod Module, and it will generate a project for us. So if we quickly look at this project, you can see that it creates a number of folders, including a sample CloudFormation template fragment. So it does a lot of heavy lifting for us when we use the CLI or the CloudFormation CLI. So the next thing I'm going to do is jump over to the app folder, and I'm going to run the CFN init command again to create the boilerplate code for us for a module. And as you can see, it did the exact same thing as a pipeline. We have a fragments folder and a number of different files for us. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy the CloudFormation templates into each of the fragment folders. And I'm going to delete the samples. And now I'm going to run CFN generate. And what this is going to do is this is going to generate our module for us. And you can see it's successfully generated. So I'm going to jump over to the pipeline folder, and I'm going to generate our module. And as you can see that it generates the complete schema for us. So we didn't have to create the schema by hand. The CloudFormation CLI did that for us. So now we use the CFN submit command. Let me use -v for verbose to so we can see everything kind of been echoed out to our terminal. Okay, the pipeline has been registered, so now I'm going to quickly register our app. And as you can see, it has been completely registered in the CloudFormation registry. And if we jump over to the CloudFormation console, we'll see that our modules are registered. And as you can see, it includes a sample template that we can use. And our module has been registered with CloudFormation. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to create a template to test our modules. So in this template, we're going to leverage both the modules. As you can see, they look just like standard resources. They have properties. We can refer to different properties within the modules. And that's what we're doing here. We have our app and we have our pipeline. So what I'm going to do is create a stack to leverage both of those modules. So I'm going to go here and I'm going to name a stack app pipeline. So I'm going to keep the standard, everything standard, and enable these. And now I'm deploying my stack. So as you can see, as we refresh, the resources are being created within our account. So if we look at the stack events, all the modules are being broke out into a number of different resources, and they are deploying in our account. That's how you create modules and reuse those across your organization in CloudFormation stacks.
All right. So now we've seen a demo on how modules work and how to deploy those. So let's expand upon that a little bit. So now let's talk about the AWS CDK. So what is the CDK? Well, the AWS CDK is a multi-language software development framework for modeling cloud infrastructure as reusable components. Wow, that's a lot. So let's break that down. So first, a multi-language software development framework. The CDK is available in TypeScript, JavaScript, Java, .NET, and Python. We keep all these code bases in sync, so no matter what languages you want to use, you've got a consistent interface to the APIs for working with AWS infrastructure. We provide the CDK in all these languages, and so you can reuse the same languages and the same developer tooling for applications and code within your infrastructure. Because of this, you immediately get the rich authoring experience when you're working with the CDK within your IDE. Specifically, you get content assist help. You can easily explore those APIs through your IDE, and you get inline documentation. And finally, you get the safety of type system checking in type languages. So for modeling infrastructure, the term modeling is very important here. Remember that we're working with infrastructure as code. So we aren't writing the code to create the infrastructure. We're writing the code to model desired state we want for our infrastructure. We're always working in this desired state paradigm. So we will create a model that describes what we want. Then we pass it over to CloudFormation, our provisioning engine, and it actually realizes this for us. So finally, as the reuse components, this is really the most important part of the description. The real superpower of the CDK is how it enables and encapsulates infrastructure patterns, and you can share those across your organization. This is really the big game changer, and we're going to talk a little more about this in our session, but for now, just know that you can create reusable assets inside the CDK and share them, very similar to what we saw in modules. So, all right, let's take a look at the code base. So we're going to talk about the construct library. What is that? Well, the construct library is it's a place where these best practices, these standards for creating these infrastructures as code can be leveraged. So basically, people can publish to the construct library. They can use things in the construct library. For instance, there are a lot of GA modules that the CDK has just released, like Amazon Cognito Pools, AWS Kinesis, AWS CloudTrail, have all created these modules inside the construct library. And you can leverage those by using the CDK. And there are a couple different ones that are in preview mode, like AWS AppSync, the CDK pipeline modules, etc. So at a high level, you can think of these as reusable assets that you can use to recreate this infrastructure or reuse these across your organization. Again, very similar to modules. And we'll dive a little bit deeper into that as we walk through this presentation, as we go through this presentation. So let's talk a little bit about the CDK ecosystem. Well, you have the construct library, is what I just talked about, where there is a specific site you can take and you can leverage these CDK constructs. And this is something that the CDK publishes and you can take advantage of within your organization. Next, we have other solutions inside the ecosystem, things like the solutions construct. So you can turbocharge the CDK with AWS solutions constructs. So these are vetted, configurable, high-level infrastructure as code patterns, and they're delivered by the AWS Solution Architect Group. And then there's also the CDK pattern sites. So these are a catalog of higher-level constructs provided by the CDK community at large. And then finally, we have the Awesome CDK, which is a central awesome list for CDK open source projects, guidelines, blogs, and resources. So one of my favorite parts about the CDK is the release of the Go CDK. I myself am a Gopher. I love Go. So I was excited to see this release finally get materialized. And I started using the CDK for Go, and I can tell you I really enjoy it as a Go developer. So you should definitely try it if you're a Go developer, or if you're new to Go, or if you haven't played with Go, definitely try this out and play around with the CDK. So I'm getting another email here. This time this is from Mary. So Mary needs me to create a deployment pipeline for their Angular monitoring dashboard. And This organization uses CDK constructs. So this is interesting. So this organization uses CDK, and they need a pipeline, and they need some CDK constructs so they can reuse over and over again. Well, just thinking back at what we've done already, we've created a number of different modules that can be used to solve this problem. So this is interesting. So I think we can maybe use modules and CDKs to create the solution. So let's take a look at a demo on how we can combine both these solutions to create the solution for our team and see how we can publish this across our organization.
Okay, so let's jump into the demonstration. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to verify that the modules are registered correctly in our account. And as you can see, they are. So next, we're going to jump back over to our IDE, and we're going to create a CDK project. So the first thing I'm going to do is create a folder to store our project, and we're going to call it CDK. And I'm going to change directory into that folder. And we're going to generate our project. So to do that, we're going to run the CDK init command, -- language TypeScript. Okay, our project has been generated. So let's take a quick look at the files that were created. So you can see it created a number of files, but the only one we're going to take a look at today is the cdk-stack-ts. And I'm going to copy some code into this file, and we'll just quickly talk about it. So the first thing I'm doing is I'm creating a construct leveraging the pipeline module that we created earlier. And next, I created a construct leveraging the app module that we created earlier, and I've compiled both of those into this CDK project. So I'm leveraging both those constructs into this one CDK project. So just to verify that, if we run the CDK synth command, you'll see that it'll generate a CloudFormation template very similar to what we saw earlier, but however, it's leveraging the modules, and we're using CDK to reuse those modules across our organization. Okay, so now let's deploy this infrastructure. So to do that, we're actually going to leverage the CDK to do this. So I'm going to use the CDK deploy command. And it's going to create our stack. Now let's quickly jump over to the terminal, and we can see that our stack is being deployed. And as you can see, the template is exactly what it looked like when we synthesized the stack in our console or in our terminal. And in the console, you can see that it's just a standard CloudFormation template. However, it's deploying all the resources that the module consists of. Okay, and as you can see that it's deploying all the resources, it's setting up all the infrastructure. So the CDK is doing all that heavy lifting for us. So just like we deployed a CloudFormation stack earlier during this presentation, when we uploaded it in the console, the CDK is doing that for us, but it's actually managing the complete infrastructure. And as you can see, the stack is complete. And that's how we use the CDK and modules together to create a solution that can be reused across your organization.
Now in the demo, you actually saw how we combined everything. We've combined how to use CloudFormation templates with our modules, with creating the CDK, and we created one holistic solution for this one problem. And again, we created these reusable building blocks that we can share across our organization. So we can share the CloudFormation template as a CloudFormation template. We can share these modules at large across our organization. And finally, we created these CDK constructs that we can share across our team. And we only did minimal work in creating these solutions initially and flushing them out and publishing them to a central place, whether it was the construct library or whether it was the CloudFormation registry. It saved us a lot of time and a lot of effort. So I would like to thank you for viewing this presentation, and I hope that you dive deeper into modules and the CloudFormation CDK. If you have any questions, you can contact me on social media or at my email address. I'll be happy to talk with you about infrastructure as code. And if you're walking around the reInvent arena and you see me, please wave at me or just talk to me. I'll be happy to have a conversation with you, especially if it's about CloudFormation. So my name is Brian Terry, and thank you again.